Back on MorningLine, thanks for joining us. Our guest with us this morning is Khadija Babb. She's Assistant District Attorney with the DA's office here in Davidson County, talking about the issue of juvenile crime and her job to prosecute some of these youngsters or find the best way to deal with them, along with the defense attorney and the judge and the magistrates, to hopefully get them back on track one way or the other. Your job is not just to lock them all up, even though some certainly deserve it and will be transferred to adult court, but it's to find, your job is a little different than prosecutors at the adult court.
I would say so. I would say that it's funny because I always just look at myself as kind of like an ADA and social worker kind of mix.
Yeah.
Because we try to take a holistic approach in addressing what the youth may or may not need.
And those types of things are not considered as much in adult court.
Traditionally, I would say no.
Right,
yeah.
Exactly, traditionally on that. You know, one case that's made headlines is the Kyle Yortlitz case, and plea deals that came down, and some juveniles involved in that. Just the decision-making process, that's as bad as it gets, pretty much. Homicide or murder, basically. In a case like that, I don't know if you were involved with that to some degree or not, but I mean, I'm just curious, the thinking that goes into how those juveniles will be handled.
Okay, so like I said, General Moreland, she does most of the transfer cases.
Yeah.
So I don't get too involved in the transfer cases unless, of course, she's asking my opinion about something, or she, you know. So I wasn't very much involved in that, but I think that in general, with the youth, whether it's what we call a small crime, a misdemeanor, or a very serious crime like homicide, we take into account, you know, again, the holistic view of the situation. Like, have they experienced any dependency and neglect? I was talking to you about the study that we did in juvenile court, and the percentage of about a third of the kids of that 182 had some prior dependency and neglect petitions in juvenile court.
Here's the problem with that, and again, I'm a strong advocate for recovering, but if I'm a family member of someone gunned down, and you have a juvie in custody who is involved, I don't care about their dependency and neglect. To me, there is no excuse for shooting and killing someone. Now, maybe there is. Ultimately, you can understand why someone found themselves in that position, but I don't care.
And I understand.
Because my loved one's dead, and someone shot him. I don't care. And
what I say in regards to that, I understand and I totally empathize with the victims and the families, they're victims as well. And I know, and what's interesting is actually some of the victims' families, they do care. You know, they are curious about why this young person may have done that, and some of them aren't. And in those situations, we might look to restorative justice to try to work out, you know, why the youth did this and help the family as well. Because a lot of times, even just saying, okay, this youth committed a crime, we're gonna sentence them to 25 years. A lot of times there's still no healing for the family,
That's true. That's true. The loved one is still gone. And you want to do what's best for society as a whole. And I understand that. It takes someone very big. It's just some crimes are just so serious.
They are.
And maybe that doesn't mean that, you know, you don't work to try to rehabilitate. Maybe you don't put them away for life if they're that young. But there has to be some punitive reaction to that.
And I mean, I guess you were asking me about the process in determining whether a youth should be transferred. So we just start off by looking at the crime, and obviously if it's a homicide, then they're going on the transfer list. Now the process as far as the transfer hearing can be a little bit longer process, because they have to get evaluated. You have information that may come in from the detention center about how they've been behaving while they've been in detention. There are a lot of factors that go into that, and like I said, I'm not necessarily involved in the transfer cases, but we still would take a holistic approach in that regard. Obviously, if we're transferring them, we want them to be transferred. But ultimately, based on the facts of the case, you know, it would be up to Judge Calloway to decide whether or not to transfer a youth.
And every case is certainly different. When we talk about shooting and killing someone, that's the final act, but who knows what circumstances developed in that. What else was there, who was there, and that's why Judge Calloway has to look at everything. And so not everyone who commits a homicide that's a juvenile is transferred. Doesn't always happen, and in some cases they shouldn't be. There are others who will say they should, but I understand why in some cases they aren't, Not all adult crimes, if you will, are transferred to adult court, are they?
I would say no. I think also that, again, it's hard with juvenile court because the public doesn't know the facts of the case, right? So you might hear a youth shot another youth, and the case may be that they were friends, right? And they were just playing with a gun, but the public doesn't tend to get the information that we have on the inside, so it's really difficult to, because like we were just talking earlier, you see the name, you see the crime, and it's just kind of like, what in the world? Like, that kid should be sent off to, you know, but they may have not been the one to pull the trigger. They may have been with an adult. There's so many other factors that go into it that the public can't get to because it's confidential. That makes it kind of hard to even try to explain what happened.
Oh, that's excellent. That's the same pickle that DCS is in. Yeah. Sometimes you wonder why things go south with DCS. I'm always very sympathetic to that because they have an incredibly hard job and they cannot release any details to explain. There may be a great explanation.
Right.
And they can't. And just as you can't either because it's juvenile court, those records for the most part are fairly sealed. We should say that when a youngster is convicted of a felony in juvenile court, whether they go, you can be convicted of a felony and not go to adult court?
So what I would say
How
is
does that work?
You can be charged with what we would consider an adult felony, right? In juvenile court, we don't consider youth felons, right? We consider them delinquent. So you can be charged with what, if it was an adult crime, would be considered a felony, right? But it's technically not a felony in juvenile court. They're not felons.
So does that go on their record? Or when does it kick in that it becomes a scarlet letter for them?
Okay. So if they're transferred to adult court, so say for instance you have a 15-year-old that was transferred to adult court, let's just say out of Wilson County, right? If they come back into Davidson County and they pick up a theft charge, once they are considered to have been transferred anywhere, then they are, for purposes of criminal justice, considered an adult.
But if they're never transferred to adult court and they had what was considered an adult felony, or they're called delinquents, once they turn 18, that's sealed away and no one would know about that except down the road in some very unique circumstances.
So what's interesting is that I think people tend to think that it just disappears, but you actually have to come down to court and file for a motion to dismiss and expunge.
Your juvenile record, even though it's sealed, because that still could surface one way or the other somewhere down the road.
You know, you may have, 25-year-olds who are looking to get into the military, right? And whether it be their arrest record or TBI may have something that pops up. And so they'll need to come down and file for a motion to get it dismissed and expunged. And usually what'll happen in that particular situation, I'll look at their previous history, because you have people that come in that are 30-something. I mean, I wasn't there when they, were committed these, were convicted of the crimes or pled guilty, I should say. So we'll look at the history, and if they're very serious, crimes like a homicide, maybe they weren't transferred, but it's a reckless homicide and they went into DCS custody. I would ask the court, like, well, what are you doing now? Why are you trying to get this? I really delve into it before I will agree to expunge that record. If you have someone who's trying to get into the military, they did this 20 years ago, they've changed their life around, then usually I would say, okay, if they haven't done anything as an adult, that's another thing we look at. I'll agree to say, okay, I don't have any objection to them getting their record.
And that's in the juvenile record. We were talking off air before about someone who commits the crime. If they're transferred, or if you're a young person, maybe they've just turned 18, you're adult then at that point anyway. And if you have a is armed robbery a violent felony?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So would that be something that is pretty much with you the rest of your life?
Pretty much, yeah. So once you become an adult, even if you are transferred as a juvenile, that's kind of on your record, unless you do some sort of like expungible probation, but you will have to qualify for that and go through a process for that. And usually the kids that we say are transferred, they don't qualify for that expungible probation. So you have a 15 or 16-year-old who has a homicide on their record, and that's going to be there for the rest of their life, probably. Even after they are released, at some point, if they are released.
Yeah, when they're released, it's going to be there. and it just doesn't go, which is another reason, homicide being the worst you use there. But there can be other felonies that maybe are lesser than that.
Aggravated robbery.
It's going to be on your record. So when you make that transfer, it's not only that they're in the adult system, which is tough, and they're going to go to an adult jail or prison, but when they get out, that record is with them for, they can't vote. They can't own a gun. They
can't live in certain places.
In certain places, maybe, and they certainly won't qualify for a lot of certain jobs. And even the ones they do, once they find out that they have a record, fair or not fair, they may not hire them, right?
Right. And so I think, to me, that is the overall issue, right? Because we want somebody to get out.
You want them to, when they get out, I want them to be successful when they get out.
Right. How do you rehabilitate if when they get out, you know, they don't qualify for subsidized housing, right? So let's, you know, the housing might be an issue because they have a previous record. They might not be able to find employment because of their record. They definitely can't vote, so at that point they don't feel a part of the community, you know. They're not as invested in the community, I should say. And how do they make money? How do they survive? You know, that's kind of
they're going to turn back to crime.
Exactly.
Is what ultimately comes down to it. The youngest that you've seen in court before you?
I think the youngest that I've seen is maybe 10 or 11.
Usually some kind of shoplifting, assault, vandalism?
Usually probably like an assault.
And what's it like when you're there? I mean, I can just imagine a 10-year-old, I mean, my goodness. When they come in there to the courtroom and they're there and it's a little 10-year-old,
and I mean, usually if it's a 10 or 11 or 12-year-old, sometimes I'll usually talk to the defense attorney ahead of time, and we'll try to figure out, because there may be a mental health issue there, usually, most of the time, right? So we try to figure out, well, are they getting services? You know, the defense attorney might look into their school record to see if they have an IEP and things like that, and we try to give them services to support them in that moment. So usually I would say, have I ever seen the 10 or 11-year-old? No, because we try to minimize their contact with the court and try to do it.
So young, unless it's a very, very serious crime. But yes, 10-year-olds don't even understand.
Right.
Damn.
Right.
I mean, I'm trying to remember when I was 10. Geez, I mean, I would have just been terrified. I would have no idea what's going on. And at that age, but you do see, you know, more serious crimes. I'll tell you, some of these older teens, you know, 16, 17, whew, this can be scary stuff.
Yeah, and it can be, and I think it's interesting because for the most part, when I sit in the courtroom and I see the youth, I do my job 100%, but a lot of times I just notice they might be malnourished, very skinny, you know, not healthy. So it's just so many things that go into it.
You just understand that there are a lot of reasons why this happens, and the services are really the key. But you just don't want to give up on them, because eventually they're going to get out. And if you don't find a way to rehabilitate them, then you're going to have the problem later, and it's when they're really adults, and then they're real trouble.
Exactly.
So, Khadija, thank you so much for coming on. It's just a pleasure having you come on, giving us some insight into the way things work behind the scenes with prosecuting in the DA's office and juvenile court.
Yes. Thank you for having me.
We'll see you again.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
We'll take a break. I'll be back with a programming note right after this. Stay with us.